Hey everyone, welcome to the latest Doc Labs event. My name's Nick Lambert, I'm the CEO of Doc Labs, and it's really good to be able to bring this episode to you. This is one we've been planning for a little while, very, very topical, but just took us a little bit of time to put it together. And so the topic of the conversation is liability in agentic commerce, who takes the risk? And so we're all very aware, I think it's hard to be in tech or almost any industry today and not be aware of where AI agents are going to start to influence how we behave online. And very much within the realm of agentic commerce, agents will be able to buy everything for us if all the hype is to be believed very, very soon. They'll decide what to purchase, who from, at what price, and also when. But there is a problem to all of this, which is really a question of kind of liability. If things go wrong, what happens? Today, it's quite easy to pare back the breadcrumbs and try and understand who's at fault. And there's many kind of pathways in the event of the consumer being wrong or the merchant being wrong. There's understood things that would follow from that. We're moving into this kind of brave new world, this kind of open space, and all of this is up for grabs. And so the answer is that we need to try and understand who is going to become liable, because likely this is one of the topics that's really going to hold back agentic commerce at scale. And so that's really what we wanted to get into in this topic. It took a little bit of time to get this together because we wanted to get both a product perspective, and for that we have Przemek, who's I got to know you from a couple of different events. One at Liminal, you used to work at Mastercard on the payment side, and you're continuing in the product space, I think, as well. And Ronald Kogens, who's a Doc Labs attorney as well, just for full disclosure, helping us set up the company in Switzerland. But Ronald, you've also been in and around kind of fintechs, blockchain, crypto businesses and things like that as well. So you've got a really good broad understanding of new technology and how it affects kind of the legal issues. And so you seemed like the perfect couple to bring together for this event. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves just shortly. The structure for this is, if you've come onto these events before, somewhat similar. We'll be going through intros and then a kind of Q&A, and then we open up for audience questions at the end. You'll be watching this on Riverside, and if you are, can you please ask your questions in there? Francisco will compile the best ones if there's lots, or all of them if there's not that many, and then we'll ask those questions to the guys at the end. And please also let us know where you're listening from. Always good to get a sense of the geographical spread of the show. And so I will now pass over to Ronald. If you could give a kind of two minute intro or so to yourself and I guess what you're looking forward to from today's session.
Yeah. So hi everyone, as Nick already said, my name is Ronald. I'm a lawyer and partner here at MME, which is a Swiss law firm focusing on technology and also financial market law. And so I'm very much engaged in the fintech space, which of course covers digital assets, but also other forms of digital payment. And of course, by having now AI, the whole fintech industry will be reshaped completely, because we will have these agents, as we will discuss today, which are not only just executing prompt by prompt, but they also do some kind of own decisions based on parameters and also do business for the users. And I mean, that is going into fintech in a sense of that the operators are likely licensed as fintech companies, but of course these are then also operating with the whole consumer industry, whether it's merchants or services. And that's a very interesting area, and that's why I'm also very much looking forward to this conversation here, because I think we're tapping into new ground, and also into, especially from legal side, into a new area where we need to figure out in which direction it can go, and how we actually can treat these kind of agentic AI.
Fantastic. Ronald, thank you. Przemek, I'll pass over to you to do the same.
Hi everyone, my name is Przemek. I'm one of the product leads for Invela Network. We're trying to build a new infrastructure layer for open finance risk management and came out of stealth about a year ago. As Nick mentioned, I spent almost 9 years at Mastercard, initially working in emerging markets, where interestingly we had a delegation of authority, peer-to-peer challenges and how to execute that in an offline framework far before we had agents and tools and oftentimes even payment credentials, which is really key. But my last 5 years at Mastercard, I spent in new networks team and really focusing on emerging technologies, privacy preserving biometric tokens, verifiable credentials. I was a big fan of digital proofs and how can we essentially instill more trust into not just transactions but also interactions. And pleasure to be here. And I think for me, it's a really fascinating conversation about I think if there were two mandates or two requirements that I ever had at Mastercard when building products was one, is the product actually globally scalable and interoperable and extensible? And two is, what is the liability framework and what is the responsibility ultimately for executing end-to-end a payment, transaction, or interaction? So super excited to be here, and I think it will be a really interesting dialogue. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great intro, Przemek. And yeah, maybe you could kick us off then. I mean, just to try and set the stage and provide some context to people that are either familiar or even unfamiliar with the topic. How different is agentic commerce from traditional e-commerce and online payments that everyone's very familiar with today?
So I think it's really three items that come to mind. For me, one of them is actually this question of separating the actual action of making a purchase over a much longer period of time. So at some point, right, it's a situation where you're not just purchasing online or going to a physical store. You actually are delegating to an agent or a group of agents. And that execution of that transaction may happen the very next few seconds, could happen a day from now or even a month from now. So there's a lot of context and instructions that need to be preserved because all the parties interacting with such an agent actually may interact with it over a certain period of time, maybe under different circumstances. I think the second one is the breadth of the payment credentials that can be used by agents, right? Maybe very different, right? You go online, you have a credit card, maybe you can switch over to an open banking. Here, you have to actually equip an agent with an access to resources, right? So you can pull them out of your wallet or out of your 1Password. Here, the agent has to have a predetermined number of credentials and has to also prove that it can use those, right? So it's similar to sending one of my boys to actually with my credit card to get something from a lemonade stand, right, at a high school football game, right? I delegated that authority, right? A little bit different. And I think a third is really this question of liability, right? Which is what's different is all of a sudden you're actually introducing more parties, more actors, more stakeholders in the whole equation, and we are beginning to look at a pyramid, right? Now it's a chain of interactions that need to take place, whereas before it was just me, my device, my browser, and the merchant's website, right? And say a bank that's involved in the middle, or whoever is the payment credential provider. So a few things that are a bit different. I will also say is that it's not that we have AI agents running around and just making purchases left and right. It is still very new, very nascent. I think for those who have experimented with, let's say, trying to buy something with Target using OpenAI plugins, right? It was a really interesting and experience. So it's getting better, but I think we're not anywhere near to actually a full wide adoption. And I think a lot of issues that you and Ronald and others will raise in this conversation. So that to me stands out as three items.
Yeah, thanks. And it seems to be mostly used. I mean, we tend to get excited at Doc because we kind of see where the actual payment, the transaction occurs. That's really where the identity component, which is our main interest, where that becomes foundational to that transaction. But as you say, AI can be used quite extensively today in the decision making and the discovery process, and it's perfect for doing that because it doesn't really need to invoke all those different layers that you mentioned. It's only once we start to move into actual trying to execute transactions that it really does start to become problematic, where liability starts to kick in as well. Ronald, same question to you, I guess, from a legal perspective. What's the kind of most prominent legal thought that comes to mind when we're thinking about implementing agentic commerce?
So I think what's interesting is that delegation of something is not really new. Also with merchants, I mean, in the early days, you went to a merchant and you bought something with gold or with other precious metals, or you exchanged against another good, and then you went to the store and bought something with fiat cash. And after that, basically people started using credit cards, and I think there it's or just debit cards, and there it's already like a delegation, because you delegate to the bank that they do the payment to the merchant. I think the big difference now is that all this was, in most cases, easy to supervise and to control and to see that everything goes well. Because if I pay with a card, I see, yes, the payment has arrived, so I can take my stuff and I can go. And now with this AI agents, I think it's getting much more difficult, because the scope of work AI agents can do, and also the amount of delegations they can take over, is huge. And I think it's getting very difficult for the person that is using the agent to supervise and to understand whether actually the agent is doing what the person actually wants. And I think that's also where then from a legal perspective, it's getting interesting to see. So how much delegation is still in the responsibility of the user that is using a product? How much responsibility is with the person that developed the product, and how much responsibility is with the person that accepts to engage with the product? And I think all these three items come somewhere together, and is basically part of the question how we have to look at the whole structure from a liability perspective.
Yeah, very good point. And just like even hearing you guys just talk at the start, it just sounds extremely complicated, and there's lots of new things to overcome, which of course is the case. Przemek, coming back to you on the kind of product side, and you started to talk about this, I think at quite a high level during your kind of setting the scene part, but just when initiating a payment and when the thing that's initiating that payment is no longer a human, what's the challenge? We're no longer authenticating a user at this point. It's something else. So talk about the challenge of, I guess, whether it's identifying the agent or identifying the person behind the agent. Your perspective would be great.
I think a few items come to mind for me. Most immediately, I think, is this question of actually embedding the right type of a payment credential and ensuring that there's some sort of a delegation of authority for that agent to use it, right? So anybody interacting with you, I think to Ronald's point, right, that merchant can choose actually what it will accept. And in today's world, especially when it comes to, let's say, credit card payments, right, there's a very complex liability, responsibility scheme, there's rules. But I think there's one thing to remind everyone, as I was just even thinking this morning about liability, is that liability or clear chain of liability and responsibility goes only insofar as you consider all the parties that make up that ecosystem. So if they don't agree or they disagree on the certain elements of it, you don't really have that ecosystem. And so it comes from, I mean, it stems from being able to provision that payment credential in the right way, having that ability to demonstrate the right usage, and also highlight the intent. And actually that's something that we haven't really discussed traditionally in payments, right? Was what is the intent of the actual, I would say, credential payment holder? Because I think even that gap, just linking this to identity, is also not so clear, right? I think there's some specification. We have Mastercard's verifiable intent protocol. We have Visa's trusted agent protocol. But when it comes to identity and that binding of a payment credential, it is really done at the level of a private key, right? So it's not really yet going in so far as demonstrating that this is the user. there is a role here for issuers and banks to say at the time of the provisioning of a credential, with the purpose of that credential being used by an agent, there might be additional, let's say, identity verification, right? Could be more robust, could be less robust, but there's no sort of agreed upon standard in a protocol. So at some point, we do face similar challenges to like account takeover and some elements that even the best designed ecosystem will not be able to necessarily prevent. And then I guess the last item is also looking at, I may be veering too much into fraud and liability already, but to me is this question of acceptance by the merchants, right? Realizing that a lot of the fraud happens not only between a user and actually a credible merchant, but actually happens with fraudulent merchants whose only goal is to leverage your payment credential. So even if you have restrictions that are supposed to be communicated to the merchant before they accept, let's say, all the instructions about what is supposed to be purchased and up to which amount and with which merchant, they can choose to ignore it, right? So there's some additional elements that need to be worked out in terms of merchants that are fraudulent to start with, right? So some interesting challenges here where I think, Ronald, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts also on like how, to which extent, like banks and others could protect users who actually land on fraudulent merchants' websites, right, or the agents.
Yeah, I think at the end, this will be a question on how much the bank will be involved in the deployment of the agents. I mean, of course, if banks itself start offering agents that you can use for doing your payments, then the whole game is changing, and the banks will have an increased liability. I mean, especially if you mentioned if there are fraudulent merchants' websites, and I think it's going to be very hard for an agent then to identify whether this is serious or not, or maybe they can do it better than humans, I don't know. But I think then, of course, for criminals, it would be the focus on how can I trick an agent to empty a bank account. So I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion around that. And I think on the other side, what I can also imagine is, I mean, what happens, for example, if I use an agent and the agent is going to a merchant, and the agent has basically the instruction to do the best what it can for me. And the best what it can is maybe finding out a problem, a bug in the code, so that I basically can purchase things without paying or whatever, and what happens then. So it's like, I think there are multiple angles that can result in very strange situations.
You'd have lots of free stuff, Ronald, presumably as well. You'd be the best dressed guy in Switzerland.
I think there's also, Ronald, just building on your point, it's this question of, I guess I'll go back to a definition of a payments account, or just an account in general, right? I think many years ago, right, everybody kind of started getting that sense with open banking, with more tools, that the definition of a payment account is really kind of becoming stretched, right? It's all the different banks and accounts and fintechs that you're connected to, and all of a sudden, I think when it comes to building a true liability framework, that framework and that ecosystem in which you operate has become so much wider and so much broader, right, that is really harder to control. And I think that's where an example like American Express comes in, where American Express actually did introduce a new protocol, I think Agent Purchase Protection Program, recognizing that it's a closed four-party model where American Express kind of controls and has access to a lot of the information that happens between a merchant, the user, actually the bank account, the payment service providers that service that merchant. So there's a lot more information that is flowing within that ecosystem that makes such a company more confident to be able to say, hey, if you follow these rules, we'll be able to make you whole if we think there's a mistake. But when you look at broadly, which I would say is 80% or more of agentic commerce of the future, will be in an open space with new actors, new participants, multiple layers of I guess, delegation. And I think that introduces that level of complexity that we really haven't had before. And that's why I think some approaches focus on cryptographic proofs and say, how can we actually introduce more trust in that in that way and create these digital statements that can be exchanged between multiple parties that not only transact but also may interact. Because I think one thing that we're maybe my definition of agentic commerce is a little bit more broader, that it's not just transactions. It's a lot of other elements that actually happen for when the agent is executing, let's say, a plan on your behalf that may involve collection of information, collection of data, for which payment is granted, that has a larger purpose. And the more complex such system is, the more vectors there are to try to break it.
Even at a simple level, Ronald, and kind of going back to legal stuff, I mean, we've all gotten very used to kind of the like checking the box, clicking I agree, and at that point, like liability is assumed. And when we talk about the complexity that Przemek just outlined regarding agents and whether it's an agent buying on behalf of an individual and whether it has the right intent and it knows what to buy, etc. Do you think that's going to be enough in this new world, or does quite a lot of things now need to happen when we click that agree box? Are we able to, as individuals, able to delegate authority to effectively a third party?
Mm-hmm. So the I agree button is anyway something which is already or was already in the past a critical thing, especially if you click I agree and next to that you have a link to terms and conditions that are 10 or multiple pages long. So that was also, from a legal perspective, very critical. Have you actually accepted the terms or not? That's why also, as you see with most of websites now, that there is a trigger that you at least have to click on the link or that you have to open them, or with Apple sometimes you have to scroll through the terms and conditions. So which is an actional layer that you at least have scrolled through the terms and conditions or looked at them, because otherwise you could argue and say that they have never become part of the contract that will be concluded between the user and the merchant. And now, of course, with the agents, the problem is that the user is much more remote, as already explained before. So the user will even not see the I agree because he does even not know maybe which will be the merchant that he's going to interact. So he doesn't know where the merchant is located. He doesn't know the terms and conditions, the applicable law. So all these things are basically irrelevant in most cases where the agent is doing its job. So let's assume the agent is buying a flight. So then the agent is not focusing on, is the liability or the terms and conditions, is that very risky, or is the jurisdiction in the Middle East, in the US or in Europe? But it focuses more on, I need a flight at the right time, at the right price. And so that's why it's getting very difficult to argue then, has the contract been concluded or not? And that's why I think so in the US, as some of you know, there is the AI Act, which has been introduced, which is one of the first frameworks which basically tries to create a framework for AI. And there basically what the approach is that they oblige the people that basically deploy AI or develop AI, that they have some transparency and governance obligations, which in my opinion also then implies that the information of what the AI can do must be with the user, so that before you instruct the agent that you have the full picture on what it can do, what it can't do, or what risks are associated with the use of the agent, so that basically you do the consent on what you allow to do, not when you read the terms and conditions, but that you have basically a delegation where you feel comfortable and you fully understand how it works. And I think it's an interesting approach. Whether it's the right one, we will see, but it's an interesting approach.
Could it be a human in the loop almost? I know that, you know, we talk about the kind of level of autonomy that the agents would have, Ronald, and I think everyone's kind of imagining a world where you just let the thing run, you go away and you come back and all your flights are booked and your ticket's sitting in your wallet and life is good. But I'm guessing that's going to be a phased step into that, and it could be human in the loop where the agent could come back and deliver some sense of what these terms are and that they should be read, and then maybe the user needs to click at that point to say they're okay. But again, we're very keen to avoid these manual steps, so who knows how that one will shake out.
I think it's interesting to build on what Ronald mentioned is I worry sometimes about cognitive overload, and I know that's what kind of simplifies, right, how you build technology products these days is when you can actually charge the premium, when you actually abstract away all the complexity and make something very simple. But when you start thinking about disputes and, let's say, chargebacks in case of credit card transactions, you have fraud, you have regret, and you have error. And so each of the three requires some sort of a communication between the involved parties. There's more of them. There's more complex layers. There's all the activities spread out over time. And I have not yet begun to imagine what kind of a communication, to Ronald's point, needs to happen between the agents and myself, explaining what kind of terms and conditions were accepted, what kind of rules and guardrails I set, how were they modified. And then I think what we also do is we take all this cognitive load of the purchase and we actually try to verbalize it. We actually have to put it in intent, we have to write it, and then it actually opens room to disagreement over semantics. And that becomes really important. The schema, the data dictionary, the vocabulary that we all use in agentic commerce should be definitely streamlined and standardized, because it will lead to issues where even in arbitration, somebody would come in and say, well, I read those two things very differently. And maybe there'll be a third agent, an arbiter, who will say, well, according to this pattern of transactions, we're able to actually say, this is what we think was the user's intent. And I think at some point becomes he said, she said type of a thing. So I don't know what that will look like, but definitely a challenge.
I kind of wonder though, on that note though, is there not a better audit trail now? I say now, like what I mean by in the future, if you have a world where you have an agent representing an individual, you're able to tie that back to a user. The user intent is somehow captured, whether it's not cryptographically in a credential or some other method. Is there not more auditable proof going to be available in this brave new world, or less? Or do you think it's just more disputable evidence?
I think you'll see more, and that's a good thing, actually. But more that doesn't point to other elements, right, is actually introduces more complexity. So there needs to be a good balance and making sure there's no gaps. I think when you look at all different payment protocols today or agentic commerce, right, there's some unanswered questions on, for example, unlinkability of data, right, and the payments credentials. If somebody actually changes their email address, doesn't actually change their underlying payment credential that is being used in the verifiable intent, let's say, protocol. So presumably somebody could just take over your payment credentials and just keep shopping as they want to. Or the merchants could presumably start linking your purchases across multiple merchants. Even though you're using guest checkout, right? So there's a little bit of also trade-off between privacy, between the marketing needs of merchants who want to maintain that relationship, right? And so it's a worst-case scenario to see a situation where you are trading off a relationship with customers to 90% of the traffic happening with anonymous agents. And so I think that question of identity and linkability through the agent to ultimately the purse holder or the resource holder will be really key to solve, because at the end of the day, agents can't really settle their liability claims, or the impact is actually on the either on the bank or actually on the user, right, who actually is a resource holder.
That's an interesting point, and I'd like to get Ronald's thought on that. Like, it would be clear that if the bank, the merchant, or the user screwed up, it'd be quite clear to understand what the path is there, Ronald. But this obviously raises what happens if the agent screws up. Who would you like? How would we even start to think about who is liable in that, or what are? I suspect we don't know the answer to that today. But what would be the types of things that we need to work through to understand, in the event that an agent makes a mistake, how is liability assigned?
Mm-hmm. So I think the important thing to understand is that an agent itself does not have so far legal personality, which means that the agent itself cannot sue someone, and the agent can also not be sued. So it's always, from a legal perspective, you always look at a person who is responsible. So, which means that if a user is using an agent and the agent is basically creating a damage with a merchant because he he's just managed to buy stuff without paying or whatever, then basically the merchant would go after the user. Because at the end, it's like it's not comparable to a delegation if you delegate to another human. I mean, also there, in most cases, the person that delegates is going to be responsible for the contracts that will be concluded by the representative. But in some situations, so for example, if the representative is basically acting out of the scope of the initial scope, then the delegator is not responsible for that. But with the agents, the problem is that there is no one in between. So the initial person that is using the agent stays responsible, and also it must take over the liability.
What about the developer of the agent, Ronald? I often thought, like, if you do a commonly now known as know your agent KYA, where you could actually, as part of that process, understand who built the agent and understand who the legal representatives of that company that built the agent, can you actually start to think about assigning liability to the developer of the agent and not having it reside with...
Exactly. I mean, that's the second point. I mean, as a user, if I'm going to be sued by a merchant because my agent has done something wrong, or, for example, if I lost money because the agent has done something wrong, of course, then I'm going after a developer or the person that is basically operating the agent for me. Basically, at the end, it's always you're looking for a person that you can sue, and no one is going to court and sues the agent itself. And so that's why I think, coming back again to the EU AI Act, it's basically where the AI Act kicks in. So it tries basically to protect the users by defining obligations for people that either operate agents, so AI, or for people that develop agents. So even if you just develop an agent and license the agent, then the AI Act in the EU could already apply. And by that, basically, the EU wants to make sure that there is a minimal transparency, information obligation, security obligations for people that offer these kind of software, especially also in terms of fake deepfakes and also discrimination. So all these things are basically implemented in these laws. And basically the approach is a bit to protect the user from tapping into a liability for something that he just cannot know. Because at the end, I mean, I also tried OpenClaw and did some stuff with that. But for me, I'm not a coder, so I cannot really understand what the tool is doing. I'm just prompting and say, do this and that. But what it actually does in the background from a technical perspective, I have no idea. So that's why I think it makes sense that you, as an offerer of the product, that you have some kind of information obligation and due diligence obligation.
And continuing in that kind of vein, I guess we're kind of moving into the kind of responsibility and kind of fraud component just now, Przemek. I mean, what other fraud vectors does this introduce? And I'd imagine, obviously, with the fact that agents don't sleep and the fact that we might be running or will be running multiple, the stakes are increased. But what other fraud vectors open up besides liability? What else can we expect, do you think?
I think I'm going to build actually on what Ronald was talking about too, which is I think this. I feel like there's a debate certainly happening right now whether agents, AI agents, should be broadly, I'm speaking broadly, should be treated as a product or a service, and kind of like in terms of liability, in terms of what if there are known vulnerabilities in how agents execute certain commands, how they actually work on behalf of the user. Right, there's a question of identity versus identifiers for agents, right? Not a legal persona, but it could have unique identifiers. And essentially boils down to also who is the root of trust for those unique identifiers that allow you to identify an agent, right? Whether those are software companies, whether those are frontier models that go in and maybe extend their applicability. What about all the open source tools, right, out there that allow you to kind of spin up your own agents, right? I think that's really, really key, and I don't have a good answer for it. I think I think when it comes to fraud vectors, I feel there's definitely a mishmash of traditional fraud vectors that really don't go away. And I think I mentioned account takeover, kind of a private key compromise. A lot of that still applies. Use of the unauthorized use of the device by a minor, right, where the keys are sitting, right? Typical traditional problems that you would have with any other purchase, except you have now much longer chain of custody and complexity. So I imagine that those disputes, right, there's a cost factor to every dispute and liability. Every system kind of has to work without breaking the buck. And so when you have longer chains of custody and longer investigation cycles, possibly, right, that will actually cost more, right? That's kind of one direction in which it could go. I think you also have some elements where you have this kind of semantic risk that I talked about a little bit, which is whenever your agents make non-refundable purchases, right? One protocol is more lenient, another one says absolutely not. You said so, and your guardrails didn't include really other perimeters. You have the question of oftentimes how many of us go to a website and want to buy an item and actually end up subscribing, or there's kind of a renewal. A promise of a renewal to a service, right, which you may not have accounted for and not described. But I think browsing the website, many of us don't even catch it, much less us actually trying to figure out all those guardrails that I have to put together. So in some way, I may actually increasingly rely on trusted companies or trusted organizations that will actually say, I am putting together the best guardrails there are because I have thought of everything for you, right? How does that actually affect that kind of a shift in liability? Because I will choose one provider over another. And I guess another one is also is this kind of a cross-merchant, I would say, replay, or you have scenarios in the protocols where the guardrails may not be enough for the fraudster to just keep using a certain payment credential across either rogue agents, right? Because we haven't really talked about that as well, right? To say, right, we just assume that the agents are good and I know them, but what if they aren't at all, right? And then it kind of boils down to that root of trust. I'll address one quick question that came up in the chat also about are the card rails actually the best payment rail for agents? And also, should agentic transactions be treated differently in the ecosystem? I'll answer the second question first. Like, absolutely, right? I think there should be a way in our ecosystem to be able to flag some of those transactions for either additional scrutiny, additional guardrails that have to be put in place. Whether I know in the payment space we have the merchant category codes. I've always, I guess for many years, whoever was willing to listen within Mastercard, I've talked about this need to actually create the identity consumer codes on the same side to actually reflect actually the position of the user, how far they're removed from the transaction, what are the degrees of intent, and actually have this kind of a system come together. When it comes to card rails, most of the agentic commerce protocols today are credential agnostic, but they are card heavy. So they rely on the existing card network, the existing rules that are in place, the liability frameworks that are in place, but don't address, for example, how this would be done through buy now, pay later, crypto or stable coins, certainly bank payments, certainly open banking, right? So there are a lot of payment methods today that don't really have as robust liability frameworks as the card networks. And I think that's another can of worms that we haven't really opened yet or addressed that will be really interesting to see.
Yeah, fantastic. I don't know if you want to come back on any of that, Ronald. Anything that stuck out?
No, I mean, I have nothing to add to that. At the end, I think it's with the payment rails. It's the most difficult things that we need to see is basically, is there some kind of a standard that we will evolve over time? Because what I also see from legal perspective as a bigger problem is that, maybe not for a typical merchant, but in some cases you do not want to interact with a certain counterparty because of sanctions or because of other reasons, because you're even not allowed to offer it. So for example, I'm in Switzerland, if someone from Germany wants to sell something in Switzerland, you're not allowed to unless they fulfill certain conditions. And so as a merchant, I think it's getting increasingly more difficult to comply with laws. And I think that's why the approach that also Przemek mentioned before is with the credentials is something which going to be very important. And also this is maybe something then also needs to be picked up by the payment rails, so by card providers or whoever at the time then will be responsible for the settlement of the payment.
Yeah, definitely. And even Ronald, to your point as well about merchants, you even imagine, and I know the marketplaces are often not anyone's friend, but imagine the job that they have as well right now, where they've got, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of merchants selling products on their platform into countries that maybe they shouldn't be, and how hard a job they have actually identifying who are merchants that can be trusted and who aren't. So yes, definitely a very messy space. I'm thinking we kind of talked a little bit about kind of liability. I'm also wondering about kind of disputes and stuff like that as well. So if we do see something happening, how much do you see the existing kind of flows, you know, standing up to that type of flow? I mean, do you even see a scenario where actually they split the difference, and it's like, you know, if it's really hard to determine who's actually liable, the dispute flow is actually looking at you know, spreading the pain out amongst everyone in that transaction. But what are your thoughts about kind of dispute flows from a product perspective, Przemek? How do you see that kind of altering or impacting kind of user journeys and people delivering products?
I think, for one, having more digital proofs in the ecosystem is a good thing, right? So having more digital proofs being exchanged between different stakeholders is definitely a plus. And I think that will help us with some of the dispute resolutions to the extent that you're using, let's say, agents that have been verified, that the root of trust for those agents is either with the card network or with the issuer. They are maybe condoned or approved by the bank, by the merchants themselves. And so there are a lot of scenarios in which where the root of trust is actually matches and links to all the participants in the transaction or an interaction. I think those disputes will be much easier to handle. I think it's those transactions where it's actually not necessarily the case, where the users actually take a risk on their own, or the agents actually ends up purchasing on the website, which specifically does not actually authorize that agent to be able to transact, you know, without much risk. So it's really this question of your agents in the pursuit, which is very sort of a single-minded, in pursuit of the goal. Are they actually taking on more liability, especially as those liability frameworks and rules and terms and conditions are continuously changing? And so you have this mismatch of the terms and conditions changing constantly. Are your guardrails actually following, right? Like, we have so many agents, will you actually be able to manage this? And I'm kind of linking this to this kind of a cognitive overload again, and what Ronald was essentially talking about. Like, I would probably have to spend my whole day just managing the agents and the liability that they're taking on, versus me just going to a website and making a purchase. So I think you'll have this kind of a dual track for dispute resolution. One will be cleaner, clearer, all the participants in the sort of network, and then increasingly, I think you will have more and more where the agents kind of take on that risk for you.
And from your perspective, it's kind of similar question, Ronald. Like, do you think there's existing concepts that can be reused here? Do we need to reinvent the wheel in some cases?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, what legal scholars discussed already for a while, and I think the first time the discussion started when in the Web3 space people started to build up the decentralized autonomous organizations, which are actually not really autonomous, but at least from a term perspective that they have some kind of autonomy. And the question is if at one point in time also an agent should have some kind of legal personality, where basically the agent has a certain number of funds. So like a company where you basically say, okay, this is an agent that has 50K initial capital, and you can verify on chain that the capital is there. And so then basically the agent can act as a real representative that is taking over a certain liability and also duty of care. So that then also the user that is basically instructing the agent has some kind of a protection that he knows, okay, I mean, if something goes wrong, there is some funds available to cover, but also on the merchant side, that the merchant knows if someone is doing an order, that at the end there is some capital available for payment. And so I think this could be something which can become interesting in the future. But I think it also very much depends on how much agentic AI will be used in law and also in courts. I mean, maybe in the future, if agentic AI is also deciding on cases, maybe it even prefers to have a dispute with another AI than with a human. So I think it also depends a little bit on that. But I think at the end, it will go into a direction. So the bigger the transaction become that agents do, which mainly depends on that they can happen online, I think that the bigger need is here to have some kind of protection.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd be interested actually on that, like, and this is zooming out a lot more broadly than maybe the topic we'd outlined, but how quickly do you think, Przemek, that we'll start to see agentic commerce fully autonomous for, let's say, the first 1 million users online? Like, what would you put that in like months or years? Do you even want to look into the crystal ball and hazard a guess?
I would say it's not going to be next year or the next 2 years. But my take on is that it will eventually happen. I think we will get like I said, the kind of a 5-lane highway that is safe, that you actually pay for, and you pay a premium for, and actually does what it's supposed to and gets you to that objective, and you have all the participants along the way that make it happen. I think those will definitely happen. I think where the risk more comes in is those kind of open-ended agents that you can just kind of spin up, and you have this question of misaligned incentives, right? Where let's say you have a 80% discount. That's a phenomenal discount on the shoes or whatever you're trying to buy, right? That makes that agent also do internal calculations regarding the guardrails or the trade-offs. Maybe they're there, maybe they're not, and I think that those elements I think will become trickier. But when it comes to I think if I had to bet, I would say probably a lot of the agentic commerce will coalesce around trust anchors. Companies that you trust, companies that you use every day, that have respectable brands, and that can actually guarantee some resolution for you, and ideally in your favor. I will also highlight one quick element that is very different is liability and the consumer rights are actually very different in the United States than it is in Europe and the rest of the world. When it comes to actually how easy it is in the US to actually return a good and bring it back and actually say, no, I made a mistake, I regret it. You travel to Europe, you buy shoes and you try to bring them back, they're going to look at you crazy, right? So I think we also will have probably a different type of liability frameworks and disputes in different countries. And I think sometimes we take too of an American view sometimes when it comes to commerce, because of the major companies are here, let's say, right, that will follow the American liability model. Not necessarily. There's a lot more out there that I don't even know about, right? But I think we'll be really curious to see. I think you will probably see a lot more agentic commerce B2B. I think there'll be an element where you have totally different identity verification requirements. You don't have the question of somebody showing up unannounced, anonymous, guest checkout, right? I have a totally different type of a payment flow between suppliers, between organizations, and I think there you will see probably a lot more usage.
Yeah, because you could move into that kind of payment and invoice situation where there's an existing kind of business relationship set up. You kind of remove a lot of that complexity, I guess. But Przemek is the kind of B2B stuff there. Ronald, what are your thoughts? Like, again, kind of naughty question just to see when do you think like we'd actually start to see this in the wild? And I guess another question, is your firm actually starting, if you're able to say, advising companies? Are they starting to get to the point where they're seriously thinking about this and they're coming to you and your firm for legal advice around, how they should be thinking about this as these laws start to pass?
Yes, I mean, of course, and that's the beauty of fintech or tech lawyers. I mean, you always have the entrepreneurs and the developers are coming in at a very early stage when things not yet happening on the market, but when they are basically built even on paper or in discussions. And I mean, these are questions we have to tackle in our work that we do with our clients. And I mean, of course, we can also not foresee the future. And what you do so far is basically use the existing tools. So you have your terms and conditions that you draft, and you try to be, of course, as protective as possible for the provider. But on the other hand, you also try to create as much as transparency as possible. And especially, I mean, in Switzerland, we have, as in the European Union, very strict data protection laws, where also there, I think the data, using of data, where data goes, is a very important factor for agents. Because, I mean, as a user, I think you want to know what kind of data the agent is using, how is it using it, and what will be shared with the provider. Because, I mean, most people do not operate the agent on their own machine. And so I think it's from a legal perspective, it's not yet completely different as it was before. But the beauty is you have to think a little bit out of the box to see how you can solve future problems with existing tools. So that's how I can frame it.
And I know we're coming to
Please go ahead. Please crack on.
I don't know if we'll have a Q&A session at some point, but two things kind of come to my mind that are small, and maybe they're not really consequential when it comes to agentic commerce. But I feel like we won't really see a truly full liability framework in place until we also solve this kind of a last mile in dispute resolution, right? So when you have agentic commerce today and all the transactions, to what extent is the user educated enough to know what am I pursuing, what am I disputing, what evidence should I actually cite? To what extent either staff or maybe in the future bots on the merchant side, on the bank side. I think all of us could bring tons of examples. I think OpenAI and Target app shopping was a really interesting experience where it shows you products from competitors actually delivering products to wrong addresses from the wrong stores in a different direction, right? Who do you call? Do I call Target? Do I call my bank? I have a hold, right? All those issues that need to be also put in place. If they will be automated, that they should be automated in such a way that actually the user understands or can query my set of agents, or I have agents who can actually help me abstract that away, for which I'm sure I'm going to have to pay, right? Or figure out like who's going to provide that service for me. So I think that's one. And two is I'd love to see kind of this reverse impact on the credit score. So if you are actually a terrible shopper, a terrible agentic shopper, and again, some of it is actually the agent can only correct you so far. Poor semantics, bad usage, bad behaviors, whatnot. How much this actually will piggyback and reflect back on your credit score will be really interesting to see, right? There is such a thing as a good shopper and generally good shopping hygiene. If you have a bad one and your agents have a bad one, and you have a tendency to use bad agents, bad programming, maybe you're cheap, and not cheap, but maybe you're trying to go with the free software. There may be some unintended consequences. And the last one is probably the trend that we see already is the better LLMs and the better agents you have, the better off you will be. And so I imagine that wealthier consumers will actually get better deals. They will have better success in actually dispute resolution. They will actually get have better outcomes, and probably be more protected because they have access to better resourced agents. I think that's a trend that I hope we can reverse, and I hope it doesn't become the kind of a one-sided market where my agent will be scalping tickets to the high school musical just because it can make a buck, right? And is a better agent than somebody else's, right? I know it's a kind of a funny anecdote, but who knows? At the end of the day, the better model, the better agent, the better economic and commercial outcomes you will have.
I particularly like that. I'm trying to think through the how bad you'd feel if you got downgraded by an agent for being a terrible shopper and having a bad reputation. That would be surely a bad day. Just as you rightly said, Przemek, a couple of questions here. I think you picked some of them off as you went through, so thanks for doing that. Ronald, one for you here. I'm in the UK, I'm not aware of one, but ASIL is asking, is there a regulation for verifying agents in the UK, or indeed any agentic commerce regulation? Are we piggybacking on the EU as sometimes we might do in the future? Are you aware of anything that's happening?
So no, but I think so in the UK, I think they have a white paper which deals with agents, where they're basically looking at on how it can be included or treated by law. But I think for agentic agents, it's still at the very early stage. I mean, even the EU Act is not considering anything about the agents, and it's going to be interesting to see on how with an agent model you have to behave under this EU AI Act. And that's also, I mean, always a challenge from a legal perspective, that if you enact a law, it takes 1 or 2 years at least, or even more, and then we will not talk about anymore of the agentic AI that we have now, but then it's much more advanced, so law is always a bit behind, and that's why I think it's important that we create principles which also apply in the future, but which are technology neutral. And I mean, come back to the question, I think it's only the white paper that I know from the UK. There is nothing more.
Yeah, understood. And I think there's another question here from Megan, and I think it's kind of very similar to the point you made, Przemek, around or maybe it's actually you, Ronald, about kind of reading through T's and C's. And there's a notion that when we scroll, like whether it's we tick the box or we scroll and we tick the box, is evidence that, the opportunity to actually read the terms and conditions was there. Whether the individual decided to take it or not is up to them. But there's fulfilled a legal requirement. And I think Megan's question is around when agents are purchasing, they typically will need to agree to terms and conditions. Is there any concern with the agent being able to assent to the T's and C's or agree to the T's and C's before the person actually reads them? And I think that was to your point earlier.
Yeah. As said, I mean, I think so. What happens in practice? I mean, the agent is just accepting them. And then if there is a dispute, the question is not really, I think the question will not be, has the agent a capable understanding of the terms and conditions, but the question will be, is there something in the terms and conditions which is unusual, which is not acceptable for a consumer? So it will basically be the same discussion as if you just look at the terms and conditions, but you don't read it or you just don't understand them. So I don't think so that there will be a huge difference. So the court will still look at the terms and conditions in terms of, is this usual for this type of transaction, or is there any clause included where you have to say this is unexpected and it's not common and that's why it should not be valid. I mean, what will be interesting to see in the future is, so let's assume that also maybe law firms have skills that they license or sell, and then you can have your agent with a skill from a specific law firm that then has the skill to assess specifically the contracts and the terms and conditions, and then maybe the situation will look different. But for now, I would say it's from a legal perspective, you would look at the same issues, whether it's common or not.
Yeah, that's a great place to leave it. Przemek, Invela Networks, thank you very much for coming on, and also Ronald from MME. I really appreciate you guys coming on. That was Liability and Agentic Commerce, Who Takes the Risk? Again, we didn't really expect to come up with any hard and fast answers, but certainly it was an enjoyable discussion, and we thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.